The widow arrived at the ranch gate with 2 hungry children and a bundle that held almost nothing. It was the last week of August in 1886. Hester Rowan had walked for 2 days from Cinder Wash after losing her husband and nearly everything he had left behind. Cora was exhausted. Her 15-year-old son Tobin looked angry enough to fight the whole world. Behind the fence stood Calder Rusk. He was a lonely, widowed rancher whose house had become empty. Hester lifted her chin and spoke before he could ask a question. She said she could cook and clean and mend clothes. She could care for chickens and preserve food. She would work for shelter and meals. Calder studied the children. Then he looked at his cold, silent house. Finally, he opened the gate. "Help me with the house," he said. "Your kids will not go hungry." Hester stepped inside without knowing that this promise would change all their lives. 3 weeks earlier, Hester still believed her husband Dolan would return. He had left with a mule and a carpenter kit to collect wages from a freight caravan. He promised 4 days. He never came back. 10 days later, Leander Price arrived with a black ledger. Dolan owed $38.70 for food and supplies. The sewing machine and blankets had been pledged as security. Hester was given 5 days to leave her rented room. She sold her kettle and bed. She kept clothes and blanket for the children. An elderly widow named Ora Fenwick told her about Calder Rusk. So Hester walked toward the ranch. Calder gave them a small room. His rules were strict. Work began before sunrise. Water buckets had to stay full. Chickens had to be locked before dark. Nobody entered the hay barn without permission. Tobin asked how long they could stay. Calder answered as long as they worked honestly. Before sunrise, she opened the windows and cleaned the fireplace. Tobin cleared a bird nest from the chimney. Cora cleaned dusty jars and found beans and dried apples. Calder returned from the barn and stopped in the doorway. Hester noticed something else. The ranch was not simply neglected, it was wasting what little it had. The hay rested directly on the ground. Water gathered beside the barn. Cold wind struck the livestock shed from the northwest. Hester began measuring everything. She studied the slopes and watched dust move across the yard. Calder thought she was worrying too much. Bramwell Creed laughed when he saw her plan. He was a wealthy rancher who trusted old methods. Hester asked Calder for one chance. She wanted to raise the hay above the ground and build an angled wind fence. Calder finally agreed to let her test one section. By September, the whole family worked together. Tobin learned to repair latches. Cora cared for a weak grey calf. She named Mika. Calder taught the boy that strength did not require cruelty. Hester taught him that careful work could save a ranch before danger arrived. Dust moved around the fence instead of toward the barn. Hester packed hay too tightly against the wall and trapped moisture inside. Cora noticed the strange smell. Hester checked the stack and felt unexpected heat. She immediately ordered everyone to pull the hay down. Calder helped without blame. The lesson was simple, and Hester knew the real test had only begun. She understood that the ranch needed more than labor. It needed someone willing to notice what others ignored. Her work had begun. The first mistake nearly cost Hester the winter feed, yet admitting it earned something more valuable than praise. Calder began trusting her judgment. Tobin began trusting himself. Cora stopped watching the door every time a horse approached. But the debt from Dolan still followed them. In early October, Leander Price returned with his black ledger. The balance was still $38.70. Hester had 6 weeks before the final freight wagon left Cinder Wash. Hester offered to pay the debt with money saved for spring seed. Hester refused. She said a ranch could survive a hard winter, only to die in spring if there was nothing left to plant. Instead, she promised to earn the money. She began selling eggs and butter. She stitched saddlebags and quilted liners at night. Tobin repaired leather leads and helped Calder prepare cattle for winter. Cora cared for Mika and gathered eggs. Then Dr. Amos Carrick arrived to inspect livestock. He carried a thermometer and a long probe for checking hay. Bramwell Creed proudly showed him his packed barn. Every vent had been sealed. The hay was stacked tightly to keep warmth inside. Carrick pushed his probe into the center. When he pulled it out, the metal was warm. The hay smelled faintly sour. Creed dismissed the warning. At Calder's ranch, the doctor found a different system. Hay stood 9 inches above the floor. A 4-inch space allowed air to move beside the walls. A lower vent and upper vent allowed moisture to escape. Stone channels carried rainwater away. The doctor tested the stack. The probe came out nearly the same temperature as the barn. He told Hester she had built a system that could protect the feed through winter. Creed was not impressed. A week later, Hester and Tobin went to Cinderwash to sell their goods. A hired hand from Creed's ranch mocked Tobin. He said hungry children made useful bait for a woman looking for a new husband. Tobin's hand moved toward the bone-handled chisel in his pocket. Cora noticed. Calder was too far away to stop him. Tobin remembered the broken barn door and Calder's lesson about trust. He removed his hand from the pocket. He answered calmly and walked away. Leander Price had witnessed everything. He quietly entered Hester's latest payment into the ledger. On the ride home, Calder handed Tobin the remaining coins. The boy counted them twice. They were still short. That evening, the first hard snow arrived earlier than expected. The northwest sky turned black. Wind struck the ranch with enough force to bend the cottonwood fence. Snow began collecting against the barn doors. The angled barrier worked at first. Then one section cracked. Tobin ran outside to secure it. Calder followed. Hester stayed near the barn because Mika had begun coughing. The upper vent was clear, but the drainage ditch was filling with ice. Hester realized the storm was creating a new danger. Meltwater would freeze beneath the barn and lift the foundation. She grabbed a shovel and called to Tobin. They had protected the roof and hay. Now they had to protect the ground. Before midnight, the storm buried half the yard. Hester looked toward the barn and understood that winter had finally arrived. Then, if you enjoy powerful frontier stories from Wild West Tales, then subscribe now, because this final chapter will reveal whether one desperate mother can save the ranch that saved her children. Wind struck the ranch with enough force to bend the cottonwood fence. Ice filled the drainage ditch. Hester refused to leave the barn until the water path was cleared. She knew the ground beneath the west wall was higher than the ground near the livestock shed. Hester told Tobin to reopen it. Calder grabbed the pickaxe. Together they broke through the frozen soil. The wind fence took another heavy blow. One post snapped. Tobin wanted to repair it immediately. Calder told him to stay with the drainage work. By sunrise, the ditch was open. Meltwater escaped toward the lower field instead of freezing beneath the barn. Calder stood in the doorway and stared at the work Hester had planned months before. But the storm was not finished. 3 days later, another blizzard arrived. This time the snow buried the main entrance completely. Calder opened the side door Tobin had rebuilt. It worked perfectly. Calder looked at the boy and smiled. Tobin understood what that smile meant. He had earned back his trust. Many ranchers began losing animals because their hay spoiled or their barns filled with moisture. Bramwell Creed was forced to send men across the valley to buy feed. Calder had enough. His cattle remained healthy. Hester sold butter and continued sewing. By January, she had earned nearly the entire debt. Hester stared at the sewing machine for a long moment. Calder asked what she would do with it. She said she would use it to build a proper sewing business when spring came. Calder smiled. The ranch had survived because every person inside it had learned to depend on the others. Hester had entered the ranch asking only for work. She had arrived expecting to protect her children. Instead, she became the person who protected the entire place. Tobin learned that strength meant keeping control when anger demanded action. Cora learned that even a frightened animal could recover with patience. Calder learned that grief did not have to keep a house empty forever. Bramwell Creed rode over one morning and quietly asked Hester how she had done it. She pointed toward the barn. "Nothing there was magic," she said. "We watched the land. We fixed small problems before they became disasters." Creed looked at Calder. Then he nodded and rode away. Calder returned to the house. Hester was sitting beside the sewing machine. Cora was beside her. Tobin was repairing a gate outside. Calder looked around the room. The empty chair was no longer empty. Spring light entered through the clean windows. The children finally laughed without fear. Their new life had begun. She remembered the empty room where she had first slept. She remembered Cora holding her skirt and Tobin hiding his fear behind anger. She remembered Calder standing at the gate and offering them food before asking for anything in return. Those memories made the final payment feel like more than settling a debt. It felt like closing the door on the life they had lost. Outside, the ranch hands laughed as they prepared the spring fences. Inside, Hester folded the first new cloth for her sewing business. Calder watched her and knew the house would never be silent again. And the woman who arrived with almost nothing had saved the place that gave her children a future. Story end.